So, in light of it being Mother's Day weekend, we're going to be discussing the famous and infamous women of Millionaires Row. I'm not going to do too talking because my dad does plenty. So, without further ado, the Cleveland storyteller, Dan Ruminski.
Well, good afternoon. And thank you for coming. It thrills me to no end that we have repeat folks that saw us the last time and have decided to return. And you'll never know, that just thrills me to no end that you have interest in this marvelous, marvelous history. For those of you that have not seen me, I'm Dan Ruminski. I've become known as Cleveland's storyteller. Over 8 years, we've done over 600 presentations, all of which designed to make you prouder of Cleveland. You know, when I started 8 years ago, Cleveland wasn't on this wonderful upswing. All of our sports teams were horrible. And besides that, we had these negative stereotypes going on throughout the country about Cleveland. And I resented that, frankly, and I thought, well, if I can do my part and go about and make Clevelanders proud of their city through this marvelous history, we can turn this thing around. So I'm not taking credit for anything, just telling you the facts. I get all kinds of questions. One of the things that I ran into in the job description of storyteller, it was 6 feet and below. Obviously, I didn't qualify. I was 6'6". So they told me if I sit down, I can qualify for that job description. So with your permission, I'm going to sit down and hopefully tell you a wonderful story. If I said to you, and we're going to kind of set the stage before we get into the famous women, but if I said to you, Cleveland, Ohio, you know, the greatest, wealthiest city in all the world, you surely would ask me, Dan, what Cleveland are you talking about? And I'm talking about Cleveland 1885, the grandest, wealthiest city in all the world. And so many of we Clevelanders, and I'm a Clevelander my whole life, were totally unaware of this. And that's not that long ago in the scope of things. And oftentimes I get asked, Dan, the wealthiest. I had never heard that, particularly if I get a professor in my audience who probably knows a little more history than I do. And they're most anxious to ask, where did you get that from? I never heard the wealthiest city in all the world. And there's a statistic out there that even I have trouble getting my arms around, and that is that over 1/2 of the world's millionaires lived in Cleveland, Ohio at one time. Over 1/2. Now, can we imagine, let's put 500 billionaires, the world's billionaires today, in a city. And I think we'd all agree it would be an unbelievable city. Fully employed, creative, cultural, and all the things that go into making a great city. That was our Cleveland, Ohio. And they all lived on Euclid Avenue, Millionaires Row, for the most part. And I think what people are stunned about, and if you want to have fun sometimes, drive from Public Square out past the clinic, East 105th Street, 4 miles, and visualize mansion after mansion after mansion. Many of them this size, the one that you're in today. 4 miles. And what was astounding and what separated Euclid from the rest was they were all on very large properties, some 5 and 6 acres. 1885, obviously, we still had horses, so we needed barns and all that went into having horses on the property. The fellow that called Euclid Avenue the most beautiful was none other than Mark Twain. Now, I taught history, and I never put Mark Twain in Cleveland at all. So how did he know? Well, he lived with a family called Severance. And you might recognize. And Mark Twain not only lived with the Severances, but he traveled with the Severances all over the world. So he saw all the other great avenues, whether it was London or Paris or Moscow, and he concluded our Euclid Avenue, the grandest, most beautiful in all the world. Some 250 mansions. This was not the biggest, by the way. There were 3 or 4 others that were bigger. The biggest was 55,000 square feet. And if you want to say hello, as you drive by, it's no longer there, but wave at Channel 5. That's where the mansion was. And by the way, it was on a large hill. When you look at that today, it looks perfectly flat. This was on a large hill, and they could see Lake Erie from their backyard, right there. And by the way, if you followed that wonderful TV series, Downton Abbey, You know that castle had about 30 servants? St. Andrew's Mansion, which is where Channel 5 is today, had over 100 servants. So nothing exceeded her Cleveland. This mansion, probably an internal staff, which always fascinates me, would have been 15 to 20 people to run the mansion. That's not including maintenance and the gardens. That would just be interior staff. And yet you had this going on, mansion after mansion after mansion. They all had wonderful third-floor ballrooms. They would entertain sometimes 1,000 people. The Cleveland Orchestra was not unusual to have in your ballroom. Any entertainment, world entertainer would appear on Euclid Avenue. And by the way, they didn't cater it like we do today. It was all done by internal staff. Wow. So this was our Cleveland, Ohio. Greatest city, greatest avenue. And out of this came some pretty great women. And sometimes I get asked, Dan, where do you get an idea from a story? Or for any story. I had 6 stories altogether. And in this case, I can't take credit. It was my dear wife, Jane, that approached me one day, and she said, you talk about the men on Millionaires Row. Wouldn't it be nice if you create a story about the women on Millionaires Row? And it didn't take much convincing. I am a believer that behind every great man, there's a great woman. And so I said, well, let me do some research. And as I got into it, I said, would you mind if we expanded it to the famous and infamous women of Millionaires Row? And being a storyteller, it seemed to me that might have a little more pizzazz to it. And so we agreed, and we did the research, and I put the story together. And as we usually do, I put a press release out and put it on our website. And lo and behold, we were getting calls from women's clubs all over Greater Cleveland, more than I've ever seen before. And so I would show up, and I would be the only man. And I thought this was wonderful. And if you had this in your experience, whether you're the only women in a man's group or the only man in a women's group, you get a little more attention. And it was, Mr. Ruminski, can I do this for you? And Mr. Ruminski, may I do this for you? Would you please sit at our table? All those things that go into that wonderful arena that I tended to enjoy. I made only one mistake in this whole thing. I went home and told dear Jane about it. Dear Jane is with us this afternoon, and she doesn't miss many talks. So that's the background. We're going to talk about 3 women. One was definitely the most famous, and was the first lady of Cleveland with her husband without even holding elective office. But they were the first family of Cleveland for over 2 decades, over 20 years. Our second young lady was the most infamous, and she was a swindler. And when you're all done with the story, you may admire her qualities, even though it wasn't on the most honest plane. And then our last gal was both famous and infamous. And you may ask, how is that possible? Well, we'll explain. But one of the things that I'll share with you is that this person died in 1943 at age 86. And Jane and I had contact with her 2 years ago. So if that doesn't whet your appetite, we're going to start out with Flora Mather. And of course, you're in the Mather Mansion, and it would be very appropriate to talk about her. She was quite a young lady and was raised on Euclid Avenue. Her father was Amasa Stone, who was a railroad builder, and he built bridges for the railroads. And he had a patent, and as you can imagine, the railroads used tons of bridges, so he was kept very busy and built all over the country. And he became a multi-millionaire early on, before the turn of the century, well before the turn of the century. And he built a mansion on Euclid and East 12th Street. Now, if you want to visualize, that's the heart of the theater district. So the next time you go to the theater, try to visualize, those were all mansions through that corridor. And it was all residential, and that was considered, by the way, pretty far out of town at the time. Well, he built a very wonderful mansion, and Flora Stone was raised in the lap of luxury. Everything was at her beck and call. Servants, school, travel, whatever she wanted. But early on, she was very bent on charity, which she was taught by her family. And so many of the families on Millionaires Row, charity was extremely important. Sometimes as important as their residence or the way It was charity, and it was taught early on. She belonged to a nice little church. You would know it as the Old Stone Church on Public Square. And the church was wonderful. The young people spent sometimes 4 or 5 days a week at the church. Various social events, church events, and we all think, daycare is a fairly new nuance. It's not. At the turn of the century, they had daycare. And Flora Stone, as a young teenager, loved to work with the children at the daycare center at the Old Stone Church. And as people observed her doing this wonderful work, people looked, and I saw it in print, and they put a term on her, which I think is very appropriate for Flora Stone. They said she had angelic qualities about her. And that's quite a compliment. But indeed, when you read about her and what she did, this was not an exaggeration. To give you an idea how powerful her father was, she was going to a school, and he didn't like the school. It was pre-high school. So he bought the property across the street, and he built her own school. You talk about power. And he brought in, not only that, but he brought in the best teachers in the country to run that school. And the result of that school, you would know today, as Hathaway Brown and Laura. It was the model for the girls' prep school. So it was very big. So Flora Stone just had to walk across the street and go to school with her sister Clara. She basically had a neighbor by the name of Samuel Mather. And Sam Mather's father was in the iron ore business and also was a multimillionaire. And they lived probably within 7 or 8 doors of each other. So they would have done a lot of things as children. As Euclid Avenue was a pretty tight neighborhood. Sam Mather went to Trinity Cathedral, so he wouldn't have seen her at the Old Stone Church. But they would have run into each other at social events and all the things that went on Euclid Avenue. And as they grew up, they began spending time off the avenue. Flora Stone at one point was off the avenue for over a year. The family decided to take a little European vacation for over a year. How do you pack for a 1-year vacation? And Sam was working in his father's mines up in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So the absence connoted writing letters back and forth, and I got copies of these wonderful letters. And believe me, it was such a pleasure to read a well-written letter. Today we're all texting and we're book-sharing the language, and to actually see a letter with paragraphs and punctuation was a thrill. And it was interesting. Initially there was no romance, it was strictly friendship. And Flora Stone, sadly, was rather sickly most of her life. And she wasn't a beautiful gal by any stretch of the imagination. But it's often said, in this case I think it was pure truth, the inner beauty that she had superseded anything else about her. But she did suffer from being somewhat sickly most of her dear life. And she also had complexes, and I think because she was sickly, and it began to appear in the letters to Sam. And she said, I think I have things in my personality that people might not like, that I might offend people. Now, nothing was farther from the truth. And he would write back, my dear Flora, even as a friend, none of this is true. There's nothing you do would be remotely offensive to anybody. And she persisted through the letter writing. And what was fun is you watched the letters and you saw a romance bloom on paper. And for me, that was just great to see. And it took time. So many people get married today on the drop of a hat, and 6 months later they're divorced. This was a slow-moving relationship with childhood friends. And when they got engaged, she again wrote and said, Sam, you're building your company, which was Pickens Mather, which is still around today. And you're going to come home and you're going to be exhausted. And she said, if I ever do anything to bother you in any way, if I don't let you rest and have some peace, please tell me. Again, going back to this thing in her personality. And he would write back the same thing, my dear Flora, there's nothing you could possibly do that would remotely bother me, no matter how tired I might be or how disappointing the day. Now, my audience is very shrewd, and I hadn't thought about it this way. A person walked up to me and she said, Dan, did you ever consider that maybe Flora Stone was just a great courter? That she knew how to court men? Frankly, I hadn't considered it. But knowing Flora Stone, I think that surely would have been a far, far sidebar to her personality. Well, eventually they did get married, and they moved in with Flora Stone's father. And that was not unusual. The fathers liked their daughters close, and so the family would move in. The mansions obviously had plenty of room, and they could do this. Now, Flora Stone's life was not without tragedy, sadly. Her father basically had a son by the name of Adelbert. How many of you have been on Adelbert Drive or known about Adelbert College? And never, as I was guilty, never put that to a name. That was built in honor of Adelbert, Flora Stone's brother. And the sad part of the story, that Adelbert was a wonderful young fella. He was studying to be an engineer to work in his father's company. And he went away to college, and on a field trip, he drifted away from the crowd. And he decided to go swimming by himself. And he drowned. And by the time they got to him, he was underwater. The sad part was they didn't find the body for 2 or 3 days. But that's every parent's nightmare. And you can imagine how that affected the Stone family. Amasa Stone was heartbroken as well as his wife. And he really never ever recouped from that. During this period, Flora Stone had a sister by the name of Clara, besides having a brother, Adelbert. And Clara married a very famous fellow by the name of John Hay. And you may remember John Hay from your high school days. He was Abraham Lincoln's personal secretary. And he was Secretary of State under 2 different presidents. He was quite the fellow. And one day he arranged for Flora Stone to have supper with the president. Now we would look upon this as a big deal today. And yet back then it was not unusual for presidents not only to have supper on Millionaire's Row, but spend the night on Millionaire's Row. And it was not unusual for the folks from Euclid to go up to Washington to have dinner with the president. At that time frame, many of them were from Ohio. So this was a natural sequence of events. Well, Flora Stone was at dinner with her brother-in-law, and there was a couple there. You might recognize the name from your history, Henry Cabot Lodge. And Mrs. Lodge were there. And it was a wonderful dinner. Now, unbeknownst to Flora Stone, John Hay was having an affair with Mrs. Lodge. Some things in history never change. So that were the case. Well, Flora Stone came back to Cleveland, and basically her father experienced another tragedy. One of the bridges that he had built in Ashtabula, Ohio, of all places, collapsed with a passenger train going over in the evening. And it was a cold winter night. They used coal stoves to heat the cars. And when the cars tumbled, they flipped and the people burned to death. They could not get out of their cars. Some suggest it was over 100 people that lost their life. And there was a question on the structure of the bridge. Obviously, many bridges did not collapse, and basically whether he had built it correctly. He questioned himself, although he was never prosecuted for it, but those tragedies were more than he could bear. He did build Adelbert Drive and Adelbert College in honor of his deceased son. One day he did not come down for dinner, and the servants went up. The bathroom door was locked. They went around on a ledge, got into the bathroom, and they found Mr. Stone in a bathtub, fully clothed, full of water, with a bullet through his heart. He had committed suicide. He was also in failing health, and he was having some financial problems. So life just became not worth living, and that was the end result. But Flora Stone, looking back, the death of a brother and the death of a father in that fashion, a life, again, without tragedy. Well, she inherited a lot of money based on her father's death, and she felt guilty. She felt this was unearned money, and she did not deserve it. And she thought the alternative then was to throw herself into charitable works. One of the first things they did with her sister Clara is they built a monument to their father. And you would know it as the Amasa Stone Chapel on Euclid Avenue today, which is part of Case Western Reserve. And it's a beautiful, beautiful church. But in throwing herself into charity, she founded or was part of some 35 different charities, most of which are still around today. They had great longevity. One of my favorite was the Visiting Nurses Association, which some of you may be familiar with, that do great work today. It was founded by the ladies on Millionaire's Row, and it was founded to kind of help out the Irish and other immigrants that were living around Whiskey Island and in the flats. And they were brought in to dig the canals and do other hard labor. And they lived in squalor. They lived in paper worker shacks. There was no sanitation, there was disease rampant, and all the things that go into that kind of living. So the Visiting Nurses Association was founded to help those people out. That shows you the dedication of these ladies on Millionaires Row. They didn't have to do this stuff, but they did. Now, there were no sports clothes back there, or work clothes, so you can imagine when they went into the squalor, they were fully dressed with all their jewelry and all their dresses. But they did get their hands dirty, and they were exposed to diseases. And yet they went ahead and they did all this. And I met with the president of the Visiting Nurses Association last year, and she confirmed that all this is pretty true. And of course, we all know they're doing good work today. Well, as we approach the turn of the century, women are becoming their rightful place in society. Their vote is around the corner. And Flora Stone believed that education was going to be the key. So she threw herself into a project help promoting the Flora Stone Mather College, which is part of Case Western Reserve today. And she spent some of her most wonderful moments there. She helped build a dormitory. And you've got to keep in mind, this is a woman, the First Lady of Cleveland, has dinner with the president, goes to magnificent parties, everything at her beck and call. And yet when you read her biography, she said, the best moments I had in my life were spending with the young ladies at the college. And she showed up every day with cakes and cookies, and she would sit down with them, and she wanted to know what they were going to do and where they were going. Now we know this is true because after her death, I read letters that came back from the alumni. And they kind of reaffirmed this angelic quality about her, that she just was so caring and spent so much time. Flora Stone, it's interesting, before her death, she wrote her will about 10 years previous, and she instructed each charity not to mention her name once upon her death, a testament to her humility. And she instructed her husband, Samuel, that he was limited to a 10-minute eulogy at the Old Stone Church. And she wanted no monuments. Well, the Mathers had great fun at the Stone Mansion, but they had a little summer place of their own out in Bracknell. You would know it as the Shoreby Club today. And you might be interested, it was a 1-hour carriage ride from Euclid Avenue out to Bracknell at the time. And that mansion was built in the 1890s, before automobiles. And they would summer there and then winter on Euclid Avenue. And I'm going to speak there in a little while. And I'm thrilled to death. I've been there several times, and it's a great honor to see that and compare that to this wonderful, wonderful mansion. Well, it came time for the Mathers to build their own mansion, which is the one you're in today. But previous to doing that, Sam Mather needed to do some work and build a new church, which you know as Trinity Cathedral. And it's in the neighborhood around Euclid and East 22nd. And he hired his personal architect, Charles Schweinfurth, to build not only the cathedral, but to build this mansion. And there's another thing that Schweinfurth did that you probably experienced many times and not realize it was Schweinfurth. If you ever drive down Martin Luther King Boulevard, you'll go under 3 wonderful bridges. Those were all built by Schweinfurth. And when I go to those bridges and these gigantic boulders are pointing down with no support, I wonder how he did this. And I kind of go through quickly, but may fall out eventually. But that was Schweinfurth. And if you're driving, drive slowly. And Doan's Creek is all lined with stone. And that stone was faced by stonemasons over a mile. This was the great park that John D. Rockefeller left us. We would know it today as the Cultural Gardens. Well, the Mathers began to plan this mansion, which we're in today. And sadly, Flora Stone contracted breast cancer. And Dr. Cryle, one of the founders of the Cleveland Clinic, treated her, and they thought that basically they had cured it. Now keep in mind, back then they weren't nearly as sophisticated as we are today. It returned and she passed away. She was 63 years of age. She was the mother of 3 boys and a daughter by the name of Constance. And Flora Stone never once stepped foot in this mansion. That's a sad part of our story. Never saw it completed and never stepped foot in it. So it was Constance, the daughter, that was the mistress of the house, and the parties that were up on the 3rd floor ballroom were put together by Sam Mather and his daughter Constance. Sam Mather, as you can imagine, was devastated. He threw himself into charity as he was on the same page with Flora Stone. They both were involved in so many charities. And one of which was taking a bunch of small hospitals and converting it into a bigger hospital. You would know that today as University Hospital. And if you were there, you'll see a portrait of Sam Mather, and of course now you know why it's there. He also threw himself into expanding what was Western Reserve University in honor of his wife. He did build a building in her honor with her name on it. I think she would have been upset, but it's there today. He also was a rival with Rockefeller. As it appeared, Rockefeller wanted to do something with the university, and Mather kind of scared him off. That was his project, his wife's project, and he wanted nothing to do with that. So Rockefeller wound up doing other projects. Sam Mather spent more and more time out in Bracknell and played golf there at the old Lakeshore Country Club. You would know today as the Country Club, which is located in Pepper Pike, Ohio. And he lived a long life, lived into his 80s, and died in the early 1930s. But without question, the Mathers were definitely the first family of Cleveland for over 2 decades. And so much of the charity and everything that they did is still with us today, and we are the benefactors of the marvelous work. Thank goodness this mansion, along with 3 others, out of 250 are the only ones left. But thank goodness to Cleveland State, we've saved this mansion and we can have events like this. I'm convinced you can talk about mansions all day, but when you feel it, touch it, and see it, there's something very, very special about that. Our next young lady was a swindler. And her name was Betty Bigley. How bad can a Betty Bigley be? Well, pretty bad. She was born in Canada, and basically at a young age, she had a great talent for cashing bad checks. As a teenager, 13, 14, she began to cash bad checks. She was quite good at it, but eventually the law got on her tail, and she migrated to Cleveland, of all places, to skirt the law in Canada. And here in Cleveland, she had a sister and a husband, and they had a family, and she moved in with her sister. And that went along well for a while. She kind of was dormant as far as her fortune was concerned, but she couldn't resist. And one day she approached her sister and she said, how about if you and your husband go to the theater and I'll babysit the children? Now those of us that had multiple young children, we relish a night out with babysitting. That's a big deal. So the sister agreed, and she was off to the theater with her husband. And Betty decided to call a banker. She had all this prearranged. And the banker arrived shortly after the sister left, and she said to the banker, I own this home and all the furniture. And I need a loan. And the banker said, well, we'll collateralize the home and the furniture against the loan. And indeed he did. Now, once the loan was called, she had left her sister in the lurch, and she hightailed it to Ashtabula, Ohio. And we don't know what happened to the sister. We assume she lost her home and all her furniture. This is a swindler. Swindlers have no conscience, whether it's family or strangers. She got in trouble in Ashtabula, and now she migrates to Toledo, Ohio. And during her migration, she's married a couple of times, and she has several name changes, trying to stay one step ahead of the law. Well, while in Toledo, she gets in trouble again, no surprise, and she beats it back to Cleveland. And this is over a period of probably 10 years. And while she's in Cleveland, it looks like finally she's going to start a legitimate business. She goes into the hotel business. And she decides to operate a very high-end hotel. There's only one problem. The high-end hotel housed very high-end ladies. And I'll let your imagination go where it may. And it was a popular place. In fact, many of the widowers on Euclid Avenue and the bachelors loved to go to the high-end hotel to visit the very high-end ladies. This was strictly platonic. I believe that, I'll sell you a highway. At any rate, there was a Dr. Chadwick who had a marvelous mansion on Euclid Avenue, about East 70th and Euclid. He was quite a famous doctor. And he began to visit what now is Cassie. by her first name. And he had arthritis, and it was said that it was a great masseuse. And we won't go into any discussion on that one. But any of us that have arthritis can kind of extrapolate. And what it was said about her, she was not a good-looking woman, but when I read about her, they always warned, don't look into her big brown eyes because she'll win you over. And she had this talent where she could win over men with her magnetic personality and her big brown eyes. There was something about her. And so she wins over this doctor and they get married. Now she's living in a mansion on Euclid Avenue, Millionaire's Row. Now you would think that the Avenue, being a little bit upscale, would kind of despise her and not associate. But again, she had this personality and she actually entertained and was entertained by a portion of the families on Euclid Avenue. And one day, after some time of marriage, she approached her husband, the good doctor. Now her name is Cassie Chadwick. And she said to the doctor, I'd like to go to New York. And she didn't go into detail. He figured for a visit. And he said, I have an associate that's an attorney that will accompany you. And he'll take you anywhere you'd like to go. And so the trip was arranged, and she went up by train, and there was a carriage that met them at the train station. She immediately said to the associate, I want to go visit Andrew Carnegie's mansion. It seemed like an innocent request. And he was happy to accommodate. And so they get there, and she said, stay in the carriage, I have some business to attend to. And she left the carriage empty-handed. She was carrying nothing. And they let her in, and under the guise that she's newly wealthy and she's looking to interview servants, and do they have any ideas? And she was in for a period of time, and then she comes back out. Now she has a pouch of papers under her arm, which she didn't previously have. And obviously the fellow in the carriage noticed this. And when she approached the carriage, keeping in mind she's a swindler, she dropped the papers intentionally on the ground, knowing that several of them would turn face up. And the fellow, as a gentleman, bent over to pick up the papers, and she could see in his face he was astounded. Absolutely astounded. And she said to him, you must not tell anybody what you just read. Now, if you don't want to keep a secret, what do? You swear somebody to secrecy. And she knew that this would be wildfire as he got back to Cleveland. Now, what was in those papers that was so astounding? Well, one of them indicated that Andrew Carnegie signed a note for $5 million to Cassie Chadwick. All the money in the world. But the trump card was that one of the papers indicated that she was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. Now, Andrew Carnegie had no children, so it was upon his death she would inherit his entire fortune of $400 million. So you can imagine what this fellow read, and you can imagine when he got back to Cleveland, this spread like wildfire. She needed bankers, and where do the best bankers live? On Euclid Avenue, where she lived. And she began going to the banks, and they knew of her, they knew her. And she began borrowing money against these forged papers. One of the banks was Cleveland Trust, the bank that we probably still remember. And the president made the mistake of looking into those big brown eyes, and he gave her a lot of money. When it was found out that she was a fraud, he was demoted from president to teller. He paid a heavy price for giving in. It was interesting, the bankers, most of them belonged to the old Union Club, and you can imagine there was a group in Cleveland that couldn't understand why the ones who were lending her money were doing so. They knew everything was a forgery, so there were two groups, and you can imagine the conversations in the Union Club at night in terms of what was going on with this Cassie Chadwick. Well, she made the rounds, and people asked, well, what did she do with the money? Now, she had a little quirk in her personality. She gave most of it away. She loved to do this. Example, she was in a piano store and she saw a beautiful white baby grand piano. And she said, can I order 28 of those? I want to give them to all my friends. Now, they weren't all wealthy friends. She gave it to servants. She gave it to strangers. She gave it to a whole slew of people. This was something that she felt comfortable and wanted to do. Well, to nobody's surprise, eventually the authorities caught her and they put her on trial. And she was found guilty, and she was sentenced to over 10 years in prison. Interesting, there was a surprise guest at the trial, none other than Andrew Carnegie himself. He wanted to meet this illegitimate daughter he never had. And it's interesting, Carnegie was interviewed here in Cleveland after the trial, and the reporters asked him, aren't you terribly upset that someone kind of stole your name and did all this? And he said, no, not at all. He said, I'm really impressed the fact that the banks would lend money just on my name. So it was the opposite of what you might think from Andrew Carnegie, but that was the quote. Well, she was sent off to prison, but now she's a celebrity. You know, and I think maybe the women of the day might have admired her. Even though she was a swindler, she beat men at their own game. And as a result, she had a great following. Now, when she went off to prison, her cell wasn't like any prison cell. She had oriental rugs, antique furniture, and curtains and lamps. And people from all over the country wanted to meet her and visit her. And I would guess many of them were women who just admired what she had done in some fashion. Eventually, prison was not for her. She spent 3 years and she passed away. She was 53 years of age. So she packed a lot in what we would consider today was a very short period of time. Well, our last lady is both famous and infamous. And as I teased you, even though she died in 1943, Jane and I had had recent contact with her. And her name was Julia Drury. And if that name sounds familiar, maybe some of you belong to the old Cleveland Playhouse, which was located next to the Cleveland Clinic before they moved downtown. There's a wonderful theater. We enjoyed it immensely with the restaurant. There were small little theaters. They seated about 800 people. The Drury Theater is one of those, as Francis and Julia were the founders of that theater. And they loved it so that they built their mansion across the street. And it's still there today. It was owned by our Cleveland Clinic. So there's 4 mansions, the Mather, the Beckwith, which is going to become the Children's Museum, the Drury and the White, those 2 owned by the clinic, 4 out of 250. And it looks like we'll have those 4 for a long time. Well, Francis became a multimillionaire. He produced kerosene stoves, and he sold them to John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. And between 1905 and 1915, he sold over 10 million stoves, making him a multi-millionaire. So to kind of frame it for you in terms of millionaire, Drury was worth about 50 million. Sam Mather was worth 100 million. And John D. Rockefeller was worth $1 billion. And those were some of the top 3 here in Cleveland. Mather was the wealthiest Ohioan once John D. Rockefeller permanently moved to New York at $100 million. And that stuff always fascinates me in terms of what it might be worth today, what they can do. So, basically, Francis Drury wanted to build a mansion on Euclid Avenue. Now, Mather's building downtown to try to save the avenue. It's already declining in 1910, and Drury builds out in the country at East 86th Street in Euclid in 1910. So they were quite opposite. By the way, those were among the 2 last mansions ever built on the avenue. So already in 1910, we were declining. The sad part of our story is it was 4 generations and it was all done. It was really a very short period of time. Well, Drury owned the land across the street. You would know that today as the old Playhouse. And he wanted to be able to walk out of his home in the city and walk into a forest, into the country. So he hired a national architect and took his 6 acres and he built a forest. And it had lakes and pagodas and waterfalls and rocks and a lily pond and an amphitheater and all those things. And we know it was phenomenal. It was called the Oasis because the New York Times, of all people, sent a reporter to review these gardens. And you could tell the reporter was awestruck that this man wanted to walk into a forest out of his home, and he built it in less than a year. Some of the trees were 40 feet. Some of the rocks were 10 and 15 tons. They opened up a mine just to bring the rocks in. And railroad after railroad of dirt came in. And he built mountains and all kinds of lovely things. And it was all screened from Euclid Avenue. So Drury could be in his forest with his wife. They did some theater in the amphitheater there, a grassy amphitheater, and no one knew that you were in there. For a long time it was rumored they had a tunnel under Euclid Avenue, but that was not true. I checked it out, and it was an old culvert pipe. But it would have been nice to be able to walk through your tunnel into your gardens. Well, the Drurys enjoyed their mansion on Euclid Avenue. And one day, a group of young thespians were having dinner with the Drurys, and they approached them about doing one of the best regional theaters in the country. And the Durys used to have puppet shows in the mansion, but the puppets are still around today. And they supported the music school settlement and all the colleges as their charity was great. And Francis said, yes, I own a mansion across the street. And this was a large mansion, not as big as this one, but large. But eventually I'm going to tear it down to make more room for my gardens. And he said, you can start the theater there. I'll give you that space. So the theater started in a mansion on Euclid Avenue. And then when it came time to tear the mansion down, Drury said, I've got an old coach house on Carnegie, I'll give that to you. Eventually he needed to tear that down to make more room for his greenhouses. So he gave the theater $9,000. They went to church on Cedar Avenue and used the altar as their stage. That was the cycle until Drury vacated his gardens and gave him the land and the money to build what we all knew as the Cleveland Playhouse before it moved downtown. So the Drurys were enjoying wealth, they enjoyed Euclid Avenue, but Francis Drury had a dream. He wanted to build a large estate out in the country. Now, if you followed Downton Abbey, as many of us did, what you have to understand is that the American millionaires love that way of life, and they try to emulate it. And many of them sent their daughters over to get title from the Europeans. They understood the Europeans had no money, but they had title. The Americans had the money, and so they bought title. This was not unusual, and Downton Abbey kind of brought that out. So Drury wanted to build something that would replicate that way of life, a gentleman's farm. And he had property in a community called Wade Hill. He had a summer place, and would get out there by interurban, by the electric railroad, previous to automobiles. So he was familiar with the East Side country. And he's driving around with his chauffeur one day, and he spots a farm on the corner of Som Center and Cedar Avenues. You would know it today as Gilmore Academy. And it's 133 acres, and he began to negotiate with the farmer. And he assured the farmer, he said, I'll give you cash, but I'll also hire you for life, you and your son-in-law, and I'll put together the most futuristic farm in the world. And you could farm it, you could sell off all the crops except for what we need for the home. And the farmer decided to do this. Now, that all seems good, and Drury wound up with the property. There's only one little caveat to our story. There were two brothers in Cleveland that also wanted that property. And you would know them as the Van Swearingen brothers. Now, why did they want that property? If you're familiar with the East Side, they were taking the rapid transit all the way out to Gates Mills. And if you drive that area, you'll see these wonderful boulevards, which is where the rapid was going to go. The Drury property was at the end of the line. And the Vans either wanted to build a golf course, they wanted to build their own estate, or they wanted to build repair barns for the rapids as they made their turn back to downtown Cleveland. And they kept sending the representatives to the farmer, and they actually offered more money, as I understand it. But Drury had such a nice way, and he called them the farmer personally. The farmer sold it to Francis Edson Drury. So he went all through this to get his property. And now he's got a problem. Wife Julia does not want to go to the country. So what's a good husband to do when you have a dream and your wife doesn't want to do it? Well, better than that, he decides to bribe her. And he said, you know, Julia, you love this house on Euclid Avenue. Now, he was going to build a small cottage, as it turned out, on the property. But he said, you love this house on Euclid Avenue. And how about if I duplicate it, but make it 1.5 times bigger, so that we can entertain on a very large scale? Now, the house on Euclid's about 25,000 square feet, to give you an idea. And Julia kind of bid on that for a while. And one of the things about Julia, and you have trouble feeling sorry for her, she was only going to be on the farm about 4 months out of the year. So where you see the Durys have a large mansion in Augusta, Georgia, where they wintered. They had a lavish townhouse in New York. They had another house in upstate New York, and they owned an island outside of Georgia. And they rotated every 3 to 4 months. So the most Julia was going to be on the farm was maybe 4 to 5 months out of the year. But she hated it. And he said, by the way, I found a little architect that I know that I think will do our house in a marvelous fashion. And his name was Charles Schneider, a name that probably would mean nothing to you until I said Stan Hewitt Hall. Charles Schneider was 29 years old when he built that magnificent home, which is, I think, the biggest in Ohio. And so Drury gave him his plans from Euclid Avenue, and basically with some instruction, he said, make it 1.5 times bigger. So if you're driving on Euclid and you drive by the Drury estate, home on Euclid, and then drive by Gilmore, if you're out that way, you'll see a very eerie semblance in the two homes. Well, Julia was still unhappy. And so he decides to bribe her again. And he said, Julia, how about if I send you to Europe for 1 year? All expenses paid, unlimited budget. I think that would get most ladies' attention. And he said, you can buy artwork, and we'll display it in the mansion. Now, this was quite the norm. All the mansions on Euclid Avenue, most had very famous artwork. Our art museum was started by those private collections. And he said, I'll build a special easel, and we'll feature a painting on a regular basis. Now, this isn't any painting. This is a French Impressionist, Renoir, Rembrandt, and the ones that were just displayed at our very own art museum. So you can imagine the sum of money that was involved even back then. Well, Julia's off to Europe. And Francis now is allowed to build his estate kind of unencumbered, no interference. And he spends about $3 million on his wonderful Cedar Hill farm. It was interesting, he was in his 70s and Julia was in his 60s, and we know about 1920 that longevity wasn't nearly what it is today. And yet he's sending his wife to Europe as a super senior citizen. Wasn't going to see her for a year. So I began to read about Euclid Avenue. And many of the women were gone from their husbands 6 months to a year. They would go to Europe to do their shopping. And all the ball gowns and all the party gowns and everything initially were made in Europe, and they'd bring them back, trunk after trunk after trunk worth of clothes. And we know that husbands didn't stay at home. They went on safaris and all kinds of things. Mather would be gone months at a time on business, so they began to write letters. So I was fascinated, and one of the things that I noticed was that there were very few divorces on Euclid Avenue. So I will let you be the judge. Julia came back to the estate, and it was marvelous. You know those gardens on Euclid Avenue, Drury didn't leave those behind. He spent $30,000 in 1920, picked them up and moved them out to the farm. And the farm as well was the pictures are the most beautiful in the world, what this man did with landscape. It was a paradise. He had 5 acres of greenhouses just to support the farm. And to no one's surprise, they moved in, and Julia was not happy. She wouldn't even talk to the staff. The staff was recorded as saying that she was very short and rude and very terse most of the time that she was on the farm. Now the Drurys, what we know is they spent probably 6 or 7 summers at this farm, and that was it before they abandoned it. But one event that did occur that really put Julia over the top on the farm was it was time to have a wonderful party. And this was going to be a white tie affair. It was going to be for the top 400 families in Cleveland. And if you remember from your Downton Abbey, or you may know otherwise, white tie supersedes black tie. White tie entails as high as you can go. So this was going to be a very exclusive. Drury was going to expect 200 limousines, and he put in a special driveway so that the limousines could come in and not have to turn around. And they planned this for a year. They hired 2 orchestras. They brought in caterers from New York. Although we had 5 acres of greenhouses, he spent over $3,000 just on cut flowers for the party. And any of us that have planned a big event, you know the thrill that goes into that. A wedding, for example, you send the invitations a year in advance, and the day arrives, and you're in the receiving line, all excited, waiting for all your friends and acquaintances to arrive. And it was no different with the Drury's estate. They were very excited that this was something that they could show off their property. And you can imagine getting dressed in the morning and being perfect, with servants instructed, food is impeccable, the orchestras are ready, they go to the receiving line, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting. As best we can tell, out of the 400 to 500 they invited, less than 100 showed up. If you thought Julia was unhappy before. Now, why was that? Well, you remember those Van Swearingen brothers? They never forgot. Drury, in fact, built his house on the corner so the Vans could never put a road through that property. So it was an out-and-out feud. And they put the word out not to go to the Drury party. So the Durys moved on and spent the remaining years in Augusta, Georgia. Francis Dury had a friend in Augusta. He was a pretty good golfer by the name of Bobby Jones. And Dury traveled with Bobby Jones all over the world as Bobby Jones was playing in tournaments, in particular the British Open. At one point, Dury saw some stained glass in a castle. He bought it, had them taken out, moved, put into the mansion at his Cedar Hill farm. To nobody's surprise, Julia still wasn't happy. Well, Bobby Jones retired at age 29. He was an attorney, but he made no money because he was playing golf. And he talked to about 20 of his friends, one of which was Francis Edson Dury, Cleveland, Ohio. And he wanted to build a little golf course. And he bought an old nursery, and he built the most beautiful golf course in the world called Augusta National. And if you go into that clubhouse and you get in there, there's a plaque in the front vestibule with the founding members, and in the right-hand column you'll see Francis Edson Dury, Cleveland, Ohio. Nobody knows about this. Now, what I'd like to say is that nothing escaped Cleveland's greatness, not even Augusta National. Francis Dury, I've been at Augusta, and at one point I wanted to see that plaque. I've got a picture of it, and a friend of mine was helping me out, and I needed to get in the clubhouse. And it looked like I was making great progress, that I was going to be able to see my plaque. And finally, my friend turned to me and he said, "There's one criteria, Dan, that you have to accomplish, and I'm not sure you can do it." And I said, "What is that?" He said, "You have to be able to walk on water." Obviously, that was not within my power. But, so I came home without really seeing that in person, but if you look at the golf course, it's absolutely heaven on earth. Francis was now approaching his 80s as they spent time in Augusta. His mansion, as all his mansions, had elevators, as did this mansion. And he tripped on a rug coming out of the elevator when he was in his 80s, and he broke his hip. He was very overweight, and he spent the last 6 months of his life in bed with Julia by his side. And when I read his autobiography, he had great praise for Julia, his wife, which you think would have been the opposite of what you just heard. But they got along wonderfully, and she supported him, and he died in front of her in his bed in Augusta, Georgia. He was 81 years old, and this was 1932. It started the Great Depression. Julia came back to Cleveland. She sold off most of her properties and spent time at the farm that she hated, oddly enough, according to her great-grandson, Remington. But she eventually moved into Moreland Court, Shaker Heights, Ohio, into a lavish suite there, and supported the Playhouse, was on the board of directors until she died at age 86 in 1943. So, when all your characters are dead, that should be the end of the story. But in this case, not so. I have to give you a little background. I do work for the Cleveland Clinic, and I've spoken in the Dury Mansion on Euclid Avenue for various clinic events, and in particular I was close to Jim Young, who headed up the medical school and became a friend of mine. He's a historian, and it's quite interesting when he and I get together, we try to trump each other with stories, much like you're playing cards. And he approached me one day and he said, "Dan, we've learned that if we teach in story form, our students retain a lot more information, even at the medical school level, very complex information." And he said, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if we did an event in the Dury Mansion? You can do the Dury story, but also talk about the art of storytelling and how you put it together, and so on and so forth." And he said, "We'll have over 100 students, and we'll have maybe 20 or 30 people from the clinic, some of the top doctors that will be there." And I thought, my goodness, Jim, what a wonderful opportunity, and I was very appreciative. And lo and behold, they set up the event, and the day arrives, and Jane and I showed up and had a magnificent dinner, as you can imagine, in the mansion. And afterwards, we were having a glass of wine, as we often do, and we were in the old Dury solarium. And I looked into the living room where I was going to speak, and there was going to be 120 people, and I can assure you it wasn't crowded. That's how big the living room was. And they had a beautiful fireplace and a wing chair for me, and 2 lights above the fireplace. It was a cold winter evening, and it was just going to be a grand affair. And so I was excited, a little nervous as well. And I'm holding Jane's hand as we're having a glass of wine in the solarium. And lo and behold, I noticed that she had turned very clammy to the touch and very cold. And I looked at her, and she turned white as a sheet. And obviously, as a good husband, I was concerned. And I said, Jane, if you're ill, I know where to get a doctor. And she said, no, I'm fine. And I said, well, something's wrong. You better, I'm nervous about this speech. Tell me, because I will not be at ease if I know that you're sick or something's going on. She said, no, I'm not sick. I said, well, what's going on? She said, I can't tell you. I said, no, you've got to tell me because I can't do the speech if I don't know. And she said, well, look behind your chair. Looks nice. Fireplace, chair, lights. She said, don't you see Julia Drury standing there? I said, no. She's getting annoyed. I said, no, I don't see her. And she describes Julia Drury without ever seeing a picture, and it was pretty accurate in terms of what she was wearing and what she looked like. And I said, well, Jane, thank you very much. That's all I need is Julia Drury standing behind me tonight. Because I'm not that complimentary to Julia Drury. And we went on and we did the speech. And nothing happened. It was a marvelous evening, as you can imagine. The students were gracious and wonderful, and you could tell by the questions they asked that they enjoyed the evening and understood about storytelling, and what a great opportunity for me to do this. Storytelling has opened up so many doors for Jane and I that it's astounding. Now we move forward about 6 months. And I used to teach at Gilmore Academy. And I've been in the Drury Mansion many, many times on the campus of Gilmore. And that's how I got started. I wondered who lived there. So I started doing the history. And Gilmore has a club called their Blue-Gray Club, which are their top 100 donors. They've given millions and millions of dollars to the school over the years. And if you looked at that list, it would be like who's who in Cleveland. You'd recognize probably every name on that list. And Gilmore throws them an annual party. And this year, they heard about me and heard about the mansions being similar, and they wanted to have a party in the Drury Mansion on Euclid Avenue. And they wanted to see for themselves that the mansions were similar. So Gilmore arranged it, and they had some power because the clinic doesn't let anybody in there unless you're a clinic. But through Gilmore's power, they got into the mansion, and the day was set up for, again, a wonderful, wonderful dinner. And we showed up. Again, it was over 100 people. Jane and I had a wonderful dinner. And again, we're sitting in the solarium. I'm holding her hand, having a nice glass of wine. Before I go on, again, there's the chair and the fireplace, and a room full of people. And I looked at Jane, and she looked pretty normal. And I said, Jane, do I have anything to worry about tonight? She said, no, I don't sense Julia Drury is here this evening. I said, well, that's nice. I'll feel much better about it. So Brother Robert introduced me, and I sat in my wonderful chair with the fireplace and the lights, and I began to speak. And the moment I mentioned the name of Julia Drury, those two lights above the fireplace blinked so quickly that there was no question it was a phenomenon. It was not a short, nobody touched the switch. It was a phenomenon. Everybody in that room knew it was a phenomenon. And they gasped and they stood up. And now they're looking for me for answers. And I looked up and I said, well, thank you, Julie. It's nice of you to join us this evening. Now, what is said is when lights blink, ghosts are very happy. Why would Julia be happy that particular evening? Well, some suggest that besides the Van Swearingens ostracizing the Drurys, that Julia might have been Catholic. And Catholics, too, like many others, were somewhat ostracized by early society. So she had a lot to be happy that night. She had 100 Catholics in her living room. And we finished the talk, and you can imagine the questions afterwards and all the things that went on. Now, if that were not enough, I showed up Monday after the talk, which was on a Saturday, and I met Ron, the curator, and he wanted some pictures that I had of the Drurys, and we made copies. Go in the living room, my chair is still there, the lights are on, I mentioned Julia Drury, and the same thing happened again. And Ron said, I have never seen this in my 10 years here at the clinic. Now, the Julia Drury ghost is very famous, actually. She's in many books. She's been around for over 50 years. When the clinic bought the mansion and renovated it many years ago, the workers complained that doors were locked and windows were opened and a mysterious elevator went up and down, all without explanation. If you talk to the people at Gilmore, they've seen the same kinds of situations, and not one employee, but many, The most astounding one I got was a secretary who said to me one day she walked into her friend's office. There was somebody sitting in a chair with her back to her, and she said hello to her friend, and she heard the voice saying, "No, your friend isn't here, she's out in the parking lot." And sure enough, her friend was in the parking lot coming into the building. So not only did they see these mysterious things and heard footsteps and all those things that you hear about ghosts, this young lady, who seemed to me to be pretty sane, indicated that she actually heard a ghost speak. So you can believe what you wish. I'm only the carrier of the story. But I can tell you that if you saw those lights blink, you surely would start questioning some things in terms of that phenomenon. And obviously it made for a wonderful, wonderful evening. And I'm assuming I'll be invited back. And of course now there's great pressure.
Yeah.
Julie doesn't show up, I got a problem. You can visit the Duries at Lakeview Cemetery, along with the Mathers and so many others on Millionaires Row. There's a whole section, and you can see the wealth based on the mausoleums and the tombstones and everything, including John D. Rockefeller. I want to conclude a little bit with why we should remember the millionaires on Millionaires Row. And it's more than lifestyle, it's more than leaving us a mansion. It's the charity. You know, they had a philosophy that you could earn as much money as you possibly could. But when you were all done, you had an obligation to give back to society in a charitable fashion, in a big way. We're kind of in a time frame where some people are resentful about people that have money. And in this case, the people that have money did so much that we as Clevelanders should be grateful for. They took this philosophy seriously, and many of them couldn't wait to retire. We have the Wick family that had Big Wick Banking and Trust. Their bank was next to the Old Stone Church. Dudley Wick couldn't wait to retire. He threw himself into developing a charity hospital. And he would spend the night there, and he would send his wife with a carriage to pick up food and everything to develop that wonderful hospital. This was not like many others. What we have to be grateful for? Well, let's take an inventory. Every time you go to our art museum, world class. And not only did the millionaires donate, and there were really 3 different trusts that were solidified by William Saunders, who was a famous attorney, to come up with one trust to build that wonderful art museum. And they were great visionaries. They not only did the charitable work, but they put trust together so that over 100 years later, you and I can still enjoy these wonderful things. The Cleveland Orchestra in our Severance Hall, most of which was Rockefeller money. Severance got his money from Rockefeller. We enjoy it, world class. Our Historical Society, John D. Rockefeller was a member the whole time he was in Cleveland, one of the best in the country. Our Botanical Gardens, our Cleveland Clinic, our University Hospital, our Cleveland Foundation, our Visiting Nurses Association, our Girl Scouts, our Boy Scouts, our United Way, and I could go on for a half hour. This is the legacy that these millionaires left us. You talk about love and love of their city, Cleveland, and why Cleveland was so great. It was greater than the wealth because they did these wonderful things. How many of us go through those cultural gardens and that wonderful drive that could have been all been built up? John D. Rockefeller. Our emerald necklace, the ideas came and were supported by the millionaires on Millionaires Row. So we should know this history, it seems to me. We should be appreciative for these folks that have left us quite the legacy. And Cleveland is on the way back, as we all, I think, understand. We're returning to the greatness that we always had. It was just dormant for a while. But now it's alive and well. But I think as part of that, if I were going to suggest we do a monument on Public Square, we should do a monument for these millionaires and all the things that they left us, that so many of us are unaware of, and the things that we sometimes, sadly, even myself, take for granted when I go to the orchestra. And I look up and I see these beautiful, beautiful facilities. So you've been a great audience this afternoon. You know, I judge my audiences by a couple criteria, and you were among the greatest. I'll point that out to you. I judge by absolutely not one cell phone that often. That was marvelous. Nobody even got up and went to the bathroom. This close. 1 out of 60. And of course, there were no long coughing spells, and I thought that was marvelous. So I know you're going to go home this afternoon, and Jane and I are, hopefully with Danny and Wendy, are going to go out to dinner afterwards, and we're going to review what took place here. And you may go home, either to dinner or whatever you're going to do, and you may talk about this afternoon. And many of you may have thoroughly enjoyed this, and for that I'm very grateful. But some of you may have thought the mansion was wonderful, and I enjoyed that, and the hors d'oeuvres were grand, but the Storyteller was kind of social. And truly, I understand. I was a school teacher, and believe me, my students were not happy with me every day. But it seems to me that if you're going to go home and talk about me this afternoon, when Jay and I go out to dinner this evening, we're going to talk about you.